Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everyone in our audience, wherever you happen to be in the world. I'm Doug Silliman, president of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's program on Kuwait's upcoming parliamentary elections. For me, Kuwait holds a very special place in my heart. I served as the U.S. ambassador in Kuwait for 2 years and had the honor of meeting many, many Kuwaitis and helping Kuwait celebrate the 25th anniversary of Kuwait's liberation from Saddam's invasion. But time moves on and circumstances change, and Kuwait's longtime and respected leader, Sheikh Sabah Al-Ahmed Al has passed from the scene, and Emir Nawaf Al-Ahmed and Crown Prince Mashal Al-Ahmed have taken over the reins of leadership. The share of young Kuwaitis in the population has grown significantly, and they bring with them new ambitions and a fresh understanding of Kuwait, of the region, and of the world. And Kuwait's participatory, but sometimes rough and tumble parliamentary system of government has had trouble keeping up with the times and effectively legislating. But there is a tradition of free expression and debate in Kuwait. Some of my fondest memories in Kuwait come from attending Diwaniyas, the particularly Kuwaiti tradition of nightly discussions across the country of politics, economics, international affairs, sports, cars, music, fashion, and every other topic under the sun. And this tradition of the Diwaniyah was often described to me by Kuwaitis as Kuwait's first parliament. But now there are real questions about Kuwait's actual parliament. Following the Constitutional Court's decision in March to annul the results of the 2022 elections, the dissolution of the restored parliament on May 1st by a Mary decree, and now the holding of new legislative elections next week, many are wondering what will come next in Kuwaiti politics. So to give you a glimpse into the upcoming elections and what might come from them, we've assembled a really good panel of experts. With us today are Yasmena Al-Mulla, a producer at the Kuwait-based news outlet Manshoor, covering political and social issues in the Gulf. Her work has appeared in Gulf News, Politics Today, The Kuwait Times, Middle East Eye, Amwaj, and Receive 22. She graduated from New York University with a degree in political science and journalism. Ms. Al-Mulla, Yasmena, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We have Dr. Al-Saif, an assistant professor of history at Kuwait University, and also a non-resident fellow with us at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Dr. Al-Saif focuses on Middle Eastern public policy, history, Islamic thought, reform, transnational trends, and gender studies. He holds a PhD from Georgetown University, a Master of Education, and a Master of Theology from Harvard, a Master of Law from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and an undergraduate degree from Boston College. Dr. Al-Saif, Bedr, it's great to have you with us today. And we have Dr. Kristin Diwan, a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Her current projects concern generational change, nationalism, and the evolution of Islamism in the countries of the GCC. She has taught at the American University School of International Service, the George Washington University, Georgetown University, and also worked at the Atlantic Council. Dr. Diwan received her PhD from Harvard, an MA from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and her undergraduate degree from Baylor University in Waco, Texas. Dr. Diwan, Kristin, happy to have you with us today.
Thank you, Pastor.
I'd like to ask Bedr to start off our discussion with his view of how the Kuwaiti parliamentary system works, and maybe as importantly, how people in the region see Kuwait's sometimes messy political system. So Bedr, I'll turn the microphone over to you.
Thanks, Doug. Pleasure to be back. Let me first comment on Kuwait proper to better situate it in the region, and I have 3 points here. Let me start with the obvious. Kuwait is not doing well. Claiming otherwise is burying one's head in the sand. The signs are too many to ignore. There is a failure of leadership across the board, a lethargic political system, infested corruption, lagging development, much needed initiatives rolling at a turtle's pace, rising xenophobia, deepening ruling family infighting, and more proxy wars in parliament and the media, fake news, tense relations between Kuwait's different branches, elections on steroids, and the inability to innovate and generate new thinking, as you can tell from the system's addiction to a repeat mode. Now, all these symptoms have produced a carnival Lots of props and costumes available on demand, with politicians changing roles and modifying rules of the system at their convenience. And it's all for free. All you need to do is sit back and enjoy the show. That, in some, summarizes parliamentary politics the past few years. The frustration of many Kuwaitis is understandable, given the stagnation, and which stands in stark contrast to the country's great potential and its many talents. Now, are we living the end of the stagnation? Not quite, but it's not free fall for Kuwait, yet at least. It has the financial means and liquidity to continue bickering for a while. So Kuwaitis are bound for more black comedy, sadly. This takes me to my second point. Now, to be fair, we cannot blame all of these crises on the current political class. The problems didn't start 2 or 3 years ago, or even a decade back. Kuwait's crises are deep-rooted and involve both state and society. Everyone is implicated. They rose, I would argue, in the 1980s with the market crash, followed by the suspension of the constitution and Kuwait's occupation. Kuwait has not healed since. A total reset is way overdue, but it can only be effective if it goes to the root of the matter, which hasn't been the case as of yet. Now, how is that done? And this is my third point. It requires resolving the identity question. What does it mean to be Kuwaiti? What do Kuwaitis aspire to be? How do they get there? Now, the Vision 2035 document answers these questions, but it was written in isolation of the people and realities on the ground. I think it needs to be reassessed. Kuwait needs a real dialogue and a new pact, but it shouldn't stop at that. We should go back to the basics. How to honorably conduct oneself in the public domain. What does a Kuwaiti common good imply? What does leadership entail? How should the center of government work? How do state entities operate with one another? Where is the role of the people in all of this? How should an MP work? How does he or she connect to people? So many questions to work on that could keep Kuwaitis busy towards a common goal of bettering their system. This brings me to Kuwait's standing in the region, Doug. And here, I'm sad to relay that it has become more and more irrelevant to the neighborhood. Now, I'm basing this on anecdotal evidence. I haven't done specific research yet, and I don't have specific statistics, but I think it's worthy to examine that topic. Some in the region, especially the youth, would admire Kuwait's openness and hope for a modified version in their own countries, like a Kuwait minus the mess, if you may. Others in the region, though, take these developments in Kuwait as a warning sign. Don't politically open your system or you're going to compromise your national development. But if you take this whole development versus freedom debate, I think it's worn out. The two don't cancel one another. All you need to do is look at Kuwait in the 1960s and the 1970s. Kuwait's current state is the result of multiple crises left unaddressed. Answering the identity question and revisiting the political system would be Kuwait's first steps to addressing these crises.
Brother, thank you very much. Kristin, let me turn to you, and maybe you can drill down a little bit on some of the concerns that Brother raised. What are some of the differences in Kuwaiti societies that are manifest in elections, or frankly, just in interaction in the society, and how might they play in the coming elections and in a new parliament?
Thanks, Doug. And I think Badr really spoke to a lot of these deeper systemic and really existential issues in Kuwait. I don't mean existential in the sense that they're going to exist, but these really fundamental questions about which way Kuwait wants to go forward. I think just to help our discussion, though, I'll map out a little bit some of the main political dynamics in Kuwait today. These are really set first structurally, and it's important for everyone to understand that Kuwait is fundamentally different than the other states in the Gulf, and that the Constitution really underlines a system of power sharing. And this power sharing takes place amongst the different branches of government. Of course, the ruling family has the ruling heights. They appoint the government by appointing the prime minister, and then through the government. They appoint the council, the Minister of Justice, then also the main primary judicial council that appoints all the judges. But at the same time, it is the case that the Constitution gives the parliament power to actually hold the government accountable to some degree by being able to call in ministers and even to vote them out of office. And this includes royals, I should say, even royals holding office. And as well, the Constitution empowers the judiciary, and we've seen the judiciary actually use the powers that it has to question even the ruling family-led government and the actions that it's taken, and overturn a voted election. So what that means is that the politics underlying all of this really can have a lot of different levers to work through, right? And if we don't have a ruling family, if the ruling family is very united and very effective, they have the tools to be able to manage this entire system through the powers that I identified. But I think if we look at the main political dynamics in Kuwait today, one, the ruling family is not completely united and is not completely effective. We're still dealing with the transition from a long-standing and powerful Emir, Sabah al-Ahmed, who passed away, to his successor, Nawaf al-Ahmed. That entails a lot of political shifts. Then we have to deal with the fact that Nawaf al-Ahmed himself is rather frail. He has passed constitutionally much of his powers to the Crown Prince, Mashal al-Ahmed, which means that even there, it's a little bit unclear. The Emir is not completely out of the picture at all. And so there is some play even between the desires between these two men. And then we have, very importantly, the competition for the next generation, because we have not switched generations in Kuwait ruling family yet. We're still dealing with, men, octogenarians. And that then entails the appointment of the next crown prince. And there's competition on that and disagreement over who should play that role. So within the ruling family, there's a lot of competition, and that plays out through these other institutions, in particular, the parliament. The way the parliament acts, though, is a lot through political dynamics on the ground. And the main divisions that I would say right now are a certain stream of populism, very similar to what we see in other elected governments right now, including our own in the United States, a sort of resentment of elites, in this class, often business elites, but there's also a cultural element to that as well. We still have some sort of liberal Islamist issues on the ground as well, so that some of these things also play out through cultural battles in addition to that. And so I think those are some of the main political dynamics. And we also still have a very powerful class, I would say, still of reformers that are wanting to reform the political system, empower further the parliament, and see some deeper reforms. A lot of these linked to youth movements. So all of these are still playing out on the ground as well. And they play through the different institutions, and they play through different alliances with members within the ruling family. So that also plays out in the background. And when you throw in also a judiciary that has been able to play on the scene, you can get some idea of the complications of the Kuwaiti political picture.
Thanks, Kristin, for that introduction. That can go a lot deeper, I'm quite sure, later in the discussion. Yasmena, let me ask you to talk a little bit more about the here and the now. What does the campaigning for the elections next week look like? What are the issues that candidates are raising? And has this differed from in the past? And basically, what is the tone of the campaigning? What is the enthusiasm for another round of elections among Kuwaitis?
Thank you, Ambassador. So I think across the board, the general sentiment here in Kuwait is less hopeful and less optimistic as it was during the past two elections, as this is the third election in less than 3 years. And I think especially since that the last election that occurred was only 8 months ago. So first of all, to begin with, one of the main changes we see in this election is that there is a decrease in number of candidates running. So as of yesterday, they closed the window for candidates to run, and the number has dropped to 207 as 40 candidates dropped out since they closed the candidate registration. This is a decade low compared to the average 300 in the past few elections that occurred across the past 10 years. I think one of the main reasons for this is that, as I mentioned earlier, we just came out of an election cycle, and many candidates feel that they don't have the finances to run again, as it's pretty expensive here in Kuwait to run an election campaign. It costs generally around 40 to 50,000 Kuwaiti dinars, which is almost 100,000 US dollars. And so that's one of the biggest shifts that we see. Another shift that we see is generally during the elections, candidates set up a political headquarters where they, have talks, where they meet constituents and so forth. And so this year around, many candidates who were also former MPs announced that they won't be setting up political headquarters. And again, one of the main reasons is because of the lack of funds across the board. This is in respect to the candidates. If we shift over to the voters, I think people are very much disillusioned with the current state. And as Badr and Kristin very well explained, the problems have been mounting for a few years now. And I think especially that the fact that we have came out of an election very much recently, and many of the general issues that affect citizens' livelihoods are not being addressed. That being said, we still have a lot of issues, from poor infrastructure to a deteriorating health sector and an ongoing issue with the education system. And so I think these issues are very important to citizens and are seen as not being taken seriously. And this leads me on to your question about what are the main topics being discussed during this election cycle. So I think the main focus is centered around political reform, given the political climate in the country at the moment. So we hear a lot of talks about reforming the electoral law, which was changed back in 2012 by an Emiri decree. When it used to be that each voter was able to vote for 4 people, and it was changed to a single vote system. And so I think this has been an ongoing discussion, but we see it again during this election cycle. Another topic that's been heavily discussed is forming an electoral commission. And so following the Constitutional Court's ruling, there have been very much calls to set up this electoral commission to monitor the elections and ensure a fair election. So these are the general discussions that are being had amongst candidates. With that being said, we are not seeing as much of the candidates as we usually do. So during the election period in Kuwait, it's usually kind of like an Olympics or kind of the World Cup, because everybody is, so involved. There's so much media coverage. There's so many TV shows TV programs being hosted. There are a lot of, political talks being held. I think this election cycle, it's tuned down. Again, like I mentioned earlier, one of the main reasons is due to a lack of funding and also a general sentiment of, disillusion.
Okay, well, we've gotten from the three of you a relatively downbeat assessment of where Kuwaiti politics is right now. What I'd like to do is do another round and try to focus on something positive, and maybe we'll go back in the same order. So, Badr, maybe the real first question for you is anybody offering a message of a positive future for Kuwaitis that people have actually begun to buy into, either a candidate, not necessarily a political movement, but is there anything in Kuwait or in the region that has given Kuwaitis some hope that the system might improve and that Kuwait might improve?
Look, Doug, everyone has a positive message out there, starting from the government to the leadership, to parliamentary candidates, to even MPs when they were MPs. There is no lack of positive political messaging. The onus is on execution. Mm-hmm. And I think if you look into each center's or each branch's domain, there is so much that can be done without the involvement of the other domain. So for example, the government today can do so much to radically alter the landscape to the betterment of Kuwait and Kuwaitis. And this is not taking place. There are so many policy suggestions that could be done that can shift things around. And we see few steps here and there. I mean, you look at the way that they've looked at entrepreneurship in the past few days, in which they've allowed for people to have, such titles without having bases, for example. But these are small, isolated incidents. What you need is a national program, a national project, and it needs to be led by a young and vibrant, a cadre, a team. And there is no lack. There is so much abundance of such resources in Kuwait, I would claim. And let me tell you something. We're going through historic firsts in this year alone. As Yasmena has clearly mentioned, 3 elections in less than 3 years, and 2 elections. I teach at a university. I started the academic year with 1 election. I'm ending one with another election. This is not normal. And forget the judiciary's role, and we can get there in the constitutional court. But to me, an alarming sign is the failure to lead. Remember back in January of 2023, where there was a very simple debate about debt relief or loan forgiveness, whatever you want to call it. The answer to this is to act and to play politics. The answer is not to shirk away and resign. Within a year's span, we've had 4 governments starting in August, and we're going to have a 5th government by the end of June. So 5 governments in 1 year. This is not normal. So again, you wanted me to start positive, I ended negative, but I think it can turn around. All you need is focus. And that focus is not there yet, unfortunately.
Well, okay, Kristin, let me take what Badr just said and maybe change the question a bit, because one of the things that I have heard when I was in Kuwait, but also when I have gone back since, is that the comity, the ability of the ruling family, the government, and those who have some opposing policies are no longer able to hold productive discussions and come up with concrete ideas to implement. Do you agree with that statement, or do you see any hope that there is an agenda or a possibility of cooperation in a new parliament?
Well, I think Badr's right in a way that Kuwait's a little bit in a holding pattern. I think due to the questions at the top of the leadership, because that does still play such an important role in the government, and due to these leadership transitions that I described and the uncertainty over who's going to be basically a longer term leader in the country, those things are just playing through all the other different political situations in the country and political trends. And I think that stands in really contrast to the other countries in the Gulf, where we have super powerful, young, strong leaders that are able to just force through sort of national agendas. Kuwait is suffering through, I think, the state that a lot of democracies are right now, where you can't, if you don't have a strong leader, you can't force those things through. And there are a lot of really important issues that are really debated. These are genuine debates in Kuwait. What is the role of kind of merchant families historically? How are they helping the society? Is there a way to constrain kind of corruption or the use of very powerful people at the top, though? How should we share the wealth of the country? These are really critical, important questions. And so I think, people have different answers to those, and it often plays out through a more personal politics of personality and kind of politics of destruction. But what I would say, if I can end something hopeful, is that Kuwait's still a country where, there are constraints on the system, and that's also a positive. You still can't just pick up somebody in Kuwait and have them completely disappear. You can't do that. You still have the ability for the ruling class, and in fact, they have to deal with society, speak with them, come to compromises, as we have recently, and sort of the pardons that have happened more recently from the ruling family for, kind of political offenses. And I would say even that Kuwait has not lost its ability to come up with compromises. And if you look at the nature of the opposition, if we want to call it right now, define it such as you will in Kuwait, it's incredibly diverse. And if you look at the components of this opposition, which goes really wide, it goes all the way from Kuwaitis that were sort of naturalized later and are really dependent on the public income that comes from public jobs and the like, maybe a bit more conservatively oriented, what I like to call kind of tribal populists. There's still Islamists that function, both Salafis and Ikhwan, some of them much more sort of establishment and that work with the ruling family, and others that are more activist. You still have youth that have quite reformist agendas and other kind of middle-class elements that have reformist agendas there. You have within the opposition as well Shia that have been breaking away that used to be uniformly with the government or with the ruling family where they stood. Right now, you have some of them joining as well the opposition. So you have an opposition that looks incredibly diverse, from very urban sort of elites, young, youthful people, Shia and Sunnis, even cooperating together, Sunni Islamists cooperating with Shia, reformists and Shia Islamists. This is not something that you see in other parts of the Gulf. And I think this is a real strength of Kuwait. And we do see this opposition able to sit down with the ruling family, which is not completely unified, and to come to some agreements. And I think, in fact, there has been quite a lot of goodwill from the ruling family to try to reach agreements with this broad characteristic of people that represent really the entire country. And I think that's a super strength of Kuwait, that there is still that goodwill and that ability to compromise. The problem has been that those political compromises haven't led, as Badr said, to action. That it's very difficult to come to one agreement and to take action. And part of that, to be fair, is because Kuwait is still a relatively wealthy country. There's enough wealth around that the kind of urgency is not fully there, I think. And that's part of the problem and dilemma of Kuwait.
And Yasmena, let me ask you sort of whether Kuwaiti youth have a different view of the elections, the political process, as people who are just now coming up into the age of majority, the ability to vote and participate in politics. Do they see the situation differently than their mothers and fathers and grandmothers and grandfathers, or are there generational consistencies, generational similar attitudes toward the politics in Kuwait?
So I think I answered this question in two folds. Firstly, I think that we see a lot of youth participating in the political process now. And when I mean participating, either we see them running for parliament or for running for the municipal council or the cooperative societies, but also, taking a front and center seat at the political table, whether it be, holding talks with respective entities, whether it's be creating political campaigns to kind of push for reform and so forth. So I think there is a drive from the Kuwaiti youth to kind of, hold this whole mess together. But with that being said, unfortunately, I have to go back to the earlier mood of pessimism, as I think a lot of people today are kind of winding back from those activities. So I know a few people or a couple of youth that were, very excited in the past few elections, were participating on candidates' campaigns, helping where they can. And unfortunately, today, many of those same people are considering whether to vote or not, So I think you kind of have different ends of the spectrum. With that being said, there are currently billboards around Kuwait that are urging people to vote, especially since there is an anticipation that there will be a drop in voter turnout during this election. And I found out that this is not an initiative by the government, which usually is done by the Ministry of Information. It's rather done by a private entity and a group of people that are, trying to encourage people to go out and vote. And so I think that, especially since Kuwait is a very young country and majority of the population is under the age of 30, I think there really is a push to kind of, reform what is going on around the country, whether it be politically, socially, to kind of, find a way out of this mess. And I think it's very important, like Badr and Kristin earlier said, is to listen to what these, younger leaders have to say, because not to sound cliche, but it's kind of the future of the country. And so it's something that needs to be worked on. There needs to be, a coming of the table between all groups. The last thing that I wanted to mention is that there is some form of optimism, and I don't want to, sound very naive, but I think there are some steps that the government is taking towards ensuring that this is a fairer election. So the Ministry of Interior set up a hotline for people to send in any tips about vote buying. And they've been trying to crack down on that. Just a few days ago, they cracked down on a couple of people, middlemen and MPs that were involved in vote buying, and referred them to the public prosecution for investigation. Another thing that the government is trying to counter is the by-elections that happen. So for those that are not familiar, by-elections are elections that are informal elections held by tribes here in Kuwait. And it's kind of to decide who will be running in the upcoming elections. And then they go ahead and submit their paperwork to run in parliament. And I think not in the past election, the one before that, the government was keen on fighting by-elections, and they did a pretty good job in the previous election. And they just also, most recently, I think a week or two ago, cracked down on a by-election that happened, and again, referred to those involved to the public prosecution. So I think there is a little bit of a push to ensure a fairer election, but I think we definitely have a lot more work to do. And personally speaking, I think until we reform the electoral law, we won't see much change, because it encourages MPs to act individually rather than acting as a group. And when you have in Kuwait, we don't have political parties, but when you can have groups coming together, or people running on a like-minded message or vision, we can have definitely a better acting legislative branch that can, push for legislation.
Thank you very much, Yasmena. We've got some very good questions from our audience, and since we have only an hour, I recommend anybody who has a question to get it in early so we'll have time to address it. The last one we got is from Judy H., and it's a very basic question. I think I'll give it first to Badr. Is Kuwait a democracy? It's a basic question, but one that has a lot of layers in the answer to that. So as Yasmena mentioned, there are not organized political parties in Kuwait, but it is obviously a participatory electoral process that has at least partially empowered parliament. So Badr, what do you say? Is Kuwait a democracy?
Fair question, and I think that a question that Kuwaitis need to ask themselves as well, because I don't think when the founding fathers came together to ratify the 1962 Constitution, based on precedent of how they've shared power in the past, they had in mind a Western-style democracy. This was not the target, and I think what they've been trying to do is customize a system in which people's rights are standing, freedom and dignity is respected, and that there is that delicate balance that Kristin has alluded to. Now, that system has proven that it has a lot of deficiencies along the way. What the Constitution itself says, in 5 years' time, you can revisit the Constitution as long as you preserve the freedoms and only modify it to add further freedoms. So I think, look, it's a Kuwaiti product. And I think there are ways to even Kuwaitize it even further. And I invite everyone really to look at the very fascinating minutes of meetings for the Constituent Assembly. That assembly was formed or elected in 1962 in January, and it lasted for 11 months. And through it, they put together the clauses of the Constitution. Now, the one thing that I would notice there is, it was a rushed process in 11 months. And I think there was an exogenous element in there with the Iraq threat looming around us. Second, if you look at the minutes as well, a lot of judicial support or advisory support from nearby countries. So I think after all these years, there is room for Kuwaitis to sit together among themselves to craft a system that they feel reflects them, as opposed to having, the good support that they had 60 years ago, but I think that they do not need as much right now. That's, I think, the call to action that the government should lead. And by them leading it, I think they'll bring together people for the rebirth of Kuwait. That's what you need. You need a message of optimism, and it starts from the basics. We need a newborn Kuwait. This is a system that I know our grandfathers, our grandmothers, they fought very hard for this system. Those sailors that went and probably some never came back, those desert dwellers that had to fight for this. This was a system that brought migrant populations together, and they came together at will, and they came together with a pact in which they want to benefit one another. That founding moment is very close and dear in the hearts and minds of the people living in Kuwait. And they need to be brought in to develop that system, or the 2.0 version, if you may. And I think that's where it's not the messaging is there. Many have come out saying that we need to modify the system, we need to work in a better way, but it's not picking up at the helm. And I think that's what needs to be pushed. It will be very difficult because, as Kristin has mentioned, there are certain privileges held by certain classes in society, and they want to fight hard to maintain them. But I think the realities on the ground are different. Let me give you one very quick example. You can't have a nationality law that's impaired. We have a very serious Bidoon issue. Now, the Bidoon issue is not specific to Kuwait, if I may. It's across the region, but it's more salient in Kuwait because of our relatively open press. And that issue can't just stay butting around like this for decades. It needs to be resolved. And that's the kind of leadership that I'm hinting towards. Now, there were some efforts in the past, but they didn't get anywhere. So it's that kind of inclusivity. How do I deal with non-Kuwaitis? And the kind of rhetoric and actions that have been taking place is so unrepresentative of the country's legacy and history and openness to the other. So there is, again, a mismatch between what the vision document says and its openness to the other and realities on the ground. That needs to be also bridged.
Kristin, let me ask you a question from another inner audience. To what extent do you think that the intra-ruling family dynamics have contributed to the legislative executive gridlock, particularly since 2020, or the passing of former Emir Sabah Ahmed?
Yeah, this is a really important question in Kuwait. There's no doubt that in the past, this clearly played out through the parliament, because the ruling family. One thing to recognize is that the parliament itself, as we said, has some powers itself in being able to question ministers and to vote them out of office. It also very importantly has the power to approve the crown prince, which means they have to approve the future leadership of the country. And so that means that anyone aspiring to be the next emir in the country, one has the ability to sort of play through coalitions with different members within the parliament by supporting them. And then they can kind of help to bring down governments by, supporting them and questioning particular ministers. And they also then know that ultimately they're going to have the support of the parliament to have kind of the approval to take office. So that means the parliament really does have a play in this. We know that in the past, we've seen this very clearly happening through competing rivals. I'd say today it's a little bit less clear exactly what is going on with the ruling family. As I've already alluded to, we know that at the top, there is this transition taking place, the replacement of all of the people within the royal court, the advisors and the sort of thing, which is sort of natural, of course, coming out with the new emir. We have had as well the replacement of or the removal of a huge amount of very important sort of government ministers across the level, at the sub-ministerial level, elite people, kind of a hollowing out of the government. many of them still waiting for those positions to be nominated. There are some that think that that's also potentially a power move being taken by the Crown Prince, Michel Ahmed, to place his own supporters within government and to shape that government. Others say no, that perhaps this is just an attempt to sort of, like a lot of the Gulf governments are going on right now, to sort of remove people and to make room for kind of the reform of government and to place kind of new other people within their positions, perhaps even younger people. That's kind of still being held up. So we don't know until we kind of see like how those positions shape up. But it's important to note that that's even taking place outside of the parliamentary level, but even on the governmental level right now. And then we do know that there has been a lot of conversation happening within the ruling family with different coalitions trying to bring back some members that have been significant in the past that are currently not in government. There's always figures like Sheikh Ahmed Fahad, who still has a lot of popularity within the government. We know that he's close to the current prime minister. So that's one sort of coalition. We know that they are very not on good terms with the former Speaker of Parliament, Marzouq Ghanem. So we have these sorts of competitions that are still playing out. And some people also say the movement towards the next potential emir, which could be playing out potentially with the current prime minister, who is the son of the current emir. We know that the son of the crown prince is also kind of moving into politics as well. I think those are a little bit less clear because we have both competitions and some factions within the government, within the ruling family, but we've also seen a lot of attempts to forge some sort of unity. So I guess I would just say that process is going on behind the scenes right now within the ruling family, and a lot of it's kind of hard to see until we see some of the results. Unfortunately, that's kind of the nature of ruling family politics.
Thank you, Kristin. Yasmena, I want to ask a separate question from the audience. What has been the role of civil society in the current elections? You mentioned a private group that is encouraging people to vote. I might also add to that, what has been the role of the media, which is relatively free in Kuwait, and of social media? And have these factors been more or less important this time than in previous elections?
Basically, to answer the first question in terms of the civil society, so unfortunately, civil society doesn't have that big of a role when it comes to the elections. And so we, don't see that much influence that they have when it comes to, candidates and campaigns and so forth. There are some certain groups, depending on what their focus are. So, there are some non-governmental organizations that are focused on women's issues that would, hold political talks specifically for female candidates to kind of get their voices out there and, highlight, their voices and so forth. We also see in Kuwait, I mentioned earlier that we don't have any political parties, but we do have, let's call them political groups. These specific groups have endorsed some candidates and are helping again, with the push, whether it's be, promoting them online or supporting them in terms of, numbers of people attending talks and so forth. So there isn't that much of, much a presence of these non-governmental organizations in Kuwait. When it comes to the media, I think we cannot, discuss this elections without the media, especially in the most recent years. I would say the effect that the media has on this upcoming election is less than it had in the previous two. One big reason is that in 2020, people were heavily dependent on the media as we were still going through the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think everything moved from being offline to online. And so it did definitely play a bigger role. But I think after that, people witnessed the power that social media has compared to the more traditional routes. So you can see, maybe some candidates doing, Instagram live interviews with different, journalists or media personnel. You can see that there has been recent years a big initiative to amp up your media presence. And so many of the candidates would pay like media or advertising companies, and they advertise kind of packages for the candidates to create for them, a logo, to create for them social media posts, to also create for them TVCs. So TVCs have also become very popular in the last few years, specifically in the first, second, and third electoral districts, where candidates, release a short 30-second to 1.5 max 2-minute video on social media that have very much transferred into kind of Hollywood style videos, very theatrical and so forth. And I think we haven't seen much of that as of yet, but usually in Kuwait in general, even though it is a more quiet election cycle, we will see much more in the next week, as there's about a week left to the elections, and that's when most of the noise happens. Lastly, I wanted to mention is that the role that, and I think I spoke about this a bit earlier when we first started, is about the role of the TV programs. And so traditionally there have been, these TV programs that MPs are invited onto to speak about various issues. But in the last few years, or specifically since 2009, these TV programs have been charging MPs to appear on the show, and the cost varies. It's between 7,000 to 14,000 KD, which is about $30,000 for either half an hour or 1 hour, depending on what time slot that you appear on. And so this is also a way that has transformed the election cycle here in Kuwait, where it's becoming more of a profit-making business in terms of the media perspective. And so I think, just to sum up what I just said, yes, definitely the media has a big role to play, and we see it more and more every time. And I think that, this will continue. And I think that there's also a negative aspect to it, because as Badr mentioned earlier, there's a lot of fake news being, spread across social media. Also from these TV programs, people tend to cut up clips and then post them online, and are then taken out of context, which could hurt a candidate. Lastly, I want to mention that there is a law in Kuwait that basically says that you're not allowed to publish any information that is meant to hurt the election results or meant to hurt a certain candidate. And if you do so, you can be charged with up to, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 5 years in prison and a hefty fine of 5,000 KD, which is about $15,000, or both. So I think, there is some form of legislation to control the media during the election cycle, but definitely there's still more that can be done.
Thank you, Yasmena. I'm going to bundle together a couple of questions on the economic impact of all of this. There are several different angles that our audience has taken, asking whether, what is the role of the question of sovereign debt, not necessarily debt relief for the population, but the unwillingness to take on sovereign debt. Is there an overdependence on hydrocarbons, oil in particular, that makes this more possible? Or is the political instability itself a cause for an economic decline in Kuwait? And again, Badr, if you could just deal with this broad swath of economic issues and the interplay with politics, I'd be very interested.
Sure, but before I get to this, let me add something to what Yasmena had said. Okay. I mean, there's so much to be proud of when it comes to youth activism and activity on, social media, new media. The work that Yasmena and her team are doing at Manshoor is amazing. So you guys need to check it out if you haven't already. There is many other initiatives by other Kuwaiti youth. I'm thinking, I don't want to exclude anyone, but there's, for example, Raqib 50, which monitors the performance of MPs throughout the year. That's a very important resource for people. And I know many young people go to it. There is Mullawi's list. It looks at women empowerment. And I know AGSI, we've done a coverage of that group, and the list continues. So that, again, to your optimism, no, I see optimism in this. I see optimism in the discussions that I have with my students at Kuwait University. They're a mature bunch and they know what they want. They just need to be empowered. And if they're given that empowerment, you'll see wonders. Now, to the economic situation, Kristin said it, I mean, and I said it earlier too, when there is liquidity, you can, play around. And that's been the case. We're the most dependent in the Gulf on hydrocarbons. We're the least interested in diversifying, although it's our official mantra. I think it's either the World Bank or the IMF that had progressions or forecasts for economic growth for next year. We were at the lowest, at less than 1% compared to our neighbors between 3 and 2 and so on. So that speaks to where we're at. We tend to be the bystanders who react at the end. So one example, the whole capturing of carbon net neutrality. We've come up with the date 2050 for oil and gas products and then 2060 for the country. And that came much later as opposed to the others in the region. Now, how much is that backed up by studies, research? I've yet to see any. In terms of hydrocarbons, I think the liquidity aspect stretches even beyond this. I mean, our sovereign wealth fund is sturdy, it's strong, and it has quite some wavelength to move us through. It financed the whole occupation back in 1990. Now, God forbid, we don't want it to finance another occupation, but I think it can sustain a lot of the problems that we're going through and reduce the sense of urgency in moving things forward. And hence you see that populist streak about, debt forgiveness, paying off vacations, and the government needs to strike a responsible tone and find allies within parliament that are against that irresponsible discourse. And there are some in parliament that were against this discourse. That's the way to go. Resigning, asking for parliamentarians not to question, not to interrogate is not how the system works. We need to deal with the system until we replace it with something hopefully better.
And Kristin, I want to follow up. A couple of questioners have followed up on your mention of Marzouk al-Ghanem in your earlier statement and sort of essentially asking what is the role of sort of the two most recent dominant speakers, Sadoun and Marzouk al-Ghanem, and is there any scope that there might be a new speaker to emerge in this new round of elections in a new parliament?
Yeah, I think this is probably the most kind of, that you can see sort of significant outcome that we're waiting to see from this election. We know that prior under Sabah al-Ahmed, Marzouk al-Ghanem assumed a very powerful position heading the parliament. He's a very strong character in his own right. And he also, I don't want to be too simplistic about this, reductionist, but he does represent very well these, what you could call kind of more powerful business interested classes in Kuwait, which are both represent kind of businesses and also represent kind of very powerful families, have they have social capital and political and economic capital, I would say, all three really within the state. And so he's somebody that I think when you see a lot of the weaknesses in the system, he's been somebody who's been able to work up a very powerful individual role through kind of his force of personality and connections. I mentioned as well the way that the opposition is built in Kuwait, quite disparate, built on different elements. I think one of the ways that these different elements sort of held together was by just having an opposition to him. So personalizing sort of what you want to achieve in the state is just to get rid of him, because they saw him as someone that was blocking a lot of the things that they wanted to achieve within the government, either because he was a bit more authoritarian in the way that he was running the parliament, or because they're more populist themselves and they don't like the overwhelming power of these economic interests within the country. So at the last parliament, they were able to elect enough people to, and also by the government saying that they weren't going to intervene as much, they were able to elect Ahmed Sadoun, who is again an old, venerable, quite older gentleman figure who had a very important role historically in Kuwait through the parliament. So again, he's a figure that people could unify behind to unify the opposition. So he was the most recent speaker. So I think what's interesting in this election is that both are running. The last election, Manshoor Khanum kind of read the writing on the wall and did not run, probably because he didn't think he couldn't be elected. This time he is running. So we have both of them running. So I think this is actually a really big element of what will happen in this election is which one will get the support and be elected speaker, because that will definitely define sort of the character of the parliament coming, whether Manshoor Khanum will be able to kind of consolidate his own position. And as I mentioned, there are ruling for family elements to this too, because at least the current prime minister has an extremely frictional relationship with Manshoor Khanum. So that's definitely going to be an interesting thing to watch, which, as you can hear, has some linkages to at least economic policy making is maybe a stretch policy making, but economic interests within the country and the broad formations of sort of the opposition in the country as well.
And Yasmena, I'm going to ask you sort of a question based on a group of other questions from our audience, which is essentially, as you see the way the elections are being run, do you expect that there will be a larger or smaller percentage of people from the opposition, however you define that, in the new parliament? And will how people define the opposition, will that opposition look any different than it has in the past? Less Islamist, less tribal, younger, more liberal? What do you think is likely to come from these elections? And I know that's an impossible question to ask, but I will ask it nonetheless.
Yes, of course. Just before I go into this question, I'd like to just piggyback off of what Kristin mentioned. And in the respect of will Manshoor Khanum be elected as Speaker of Parliament, I think that will depend if he does run for the position or not, and which will depend on the number of votes that he receives after the election. And I think that would be something very interesting to look forward to, because as Kristin mentioned, Ahmed Al-Saif was the previous Speaker of Parliament, and he won the position uncontested, so no one ran against him. Also, Ahmed Al-Saif, when he ran in the previous election, was his first time back after 10 years of abstaining from politics, or at least running in politics, and he received around more than 12,200 votes, which is the highest number a single candidate has ever received since the single vote system was put in place back in 2012, which we spoke about earlier. And so I think that number, kind of showed the sheer popularity that he had. And so I guess it depends on how much either former speaker receives as to who will head the next parliament. To go back to your question, Ambassador, I think that we won't see that much change in the upcoming parliament. I think that based off of the people that I've been speaking to, we're going to see around 20 to 30% change in MPs. And when I mean incumbent MPs, because most of those that we see running now are those that were in the previous parliament or those that were in the parliament of 2020. I think that the opposition, again, the loosely coined term we use here in Kuwait, is gonna more or less, remain the same. You're gonna see certain alliances being made, which was interesting during the previous parliament. We saw a couple of blocks being formed. One being headed by Shuaib al-Muwaizri, one that used to be a group of 6 was reduced down, whom Halal al-Mudaf and Abdullah al-Mudaf and Hanad Said and so forth. We also, see shifts in how these blocks approach certain issues. And I think that would be interesting to look forward to as to who forms alliances with who. But again, we need to remember, since we are still under the single vote system, it's very difficult to stay, informed with your bloc, or to kind of continue down the same path, because at the end of the day, everybody's looking out for themselves. Everyone is, waiting to see what will happen, or how will this affect me in the upcoming elections. And so it's kind of, it demotivates group action and group work.
So we have come to the end of our time, but I want to do one very quick lightning round, and I ask each of you to give me perhaps a 1 or 2 sentence answer. So in the best possible of worlds after the new elections, what one thing would you like to have the parliament act on in its next session? And maybe we'll start again, Badr, with you.
New electoral law.
Okay. Kristin?
I'd like to see the Bajoun issue resolved. This is something that's gone all the way back to Kuwait's basic origins, and I think it really does hold back a huge element of Kuwait and is a huge danger for the future.
And Yasmena?
Element.
I have
Go
to
ahead.
agree with Badr. I've already mentioned it a few times, the reforming the electoral law.
Well, again, I want to thank all of our 3 participants. You have given us great depth, and I feel that we've only really just begun to scratch the surface of Kuwait and Kuwaiti politics. The number of unanswered questions we have from the audience also shows that there's great interest in what you have said. We will have to do this again at some point in the relatively near future. Again, thank you for all in our audience for being engaged, for asking so many good questions. And I ask that all of you will join AGSIW again for more discussions of topics of great importance to the region and the world, including tomorrow. We have a program on the impact of the victory of Recep Tayyip Erdogan for another term as president of Turkey, the impact on the Middle East from that region, from those elections. And you can sign up for that program and other future programs at our website, agsiw.org. So we hope to see you tomorrow and in the future. That's all for now. Thank you for coming.